Welcome to the section on poverty for URP 475. Some questions to consider. How do we measure poverty in the US? And how is it measured outside of the US? In considering this question, it's important to think about the key differences between a country like the United States, which is a developed country, and other countries which may be middle income or lower income, or developing, as they're sometimes called. In the United States, we use two measures. One is the federal poverty measurement, which results in the federal poverty rate that you often will see quoted. It hovers somewhere around 14 to 15%. It may have gone down as low as 12%, depending on the time period in consideration. We also use another measurement called the Area Median Income, or AMI, in the United States. However, when we are talking about developing countries, we usually use an absolute poverty measure, and this is the sort of the measure that you hear quoted when you hear about development economics, the dollar a day standard. In looking at these measures, another question we might consider is, should we have a more comprehensive view of human development? Instead of just looking at poverty, that is, looking at the number or proportion of people who are below a certain standard, a threshold, economic threshold, or above, should we look at other measurements? Why? Well, for example, you can have a family that is, or household that is not considered poor, but may still not have access to other things that enable a high quality of life. So what are these things? There are things like education, healthcare access, quality housing, amenities in the community, or even perhaps access to democracy, access to their government, access to a clean environment, and so on. So we talked about poverty in the US. Poverty in the US is usually conceptualized in terms of relative poverty. And as the definition here shows you, relative poverty is defined in terms of the typical income or consumption level in wider society. In other words, we compare how poor people are compared to the income levels and the distribution of income in society. In other words, the people in the United States are poor in relation to others who have more money. Now, this may seem like a trivial distinction, but when we look at absolute poverty, which is the poverty measurement used for those in developing or poor countries, there is a fixed line below which people are considered living in extreme poverty, and above which they are considered not in extreme poverty but still poor. And depending on where they are in terms of income, they may move from extreme poverty to poor to middle income to upper income. But absolute poverty lines are necessary because it's below these lines that we feel that a human being does not have enough money to even access the most basic of goods. And what are the most basic of goods? It's really food and water. Below this line, there's a real threat of those who live below this line of dying of malnutrition and various causes associated with malnutrition, or hunger, as we call it. The World Bank typically fixes this line nominally at $1 a day. Today's dollars, that dollar a day is about $1.95 or $1.90, somewhere in that range. So what does poverty in the developing world look like? Well, there's data that is acquired every year, and the picture is always evolving as we are able to get better data in developing countries. Now, mind you, sometimes this data is hard to come by simply because when we are looking at data in developing countries, we have to rely on local sources, and these may or may not be accurate to the same way that, let's say, a source in a developed part of the world, like the U.S. Census may be. So some statistics are presented here for poverty in the developing world. And it's kind of telling that today approximately something like 1 in 6 or in that range live between $2 and $3 a day. This is just above the extreme poverty line. That means these people are not considered extremely poor, but they are nonetheless poor. Here is a map that looks at the distribution of the of income and the countries that have the highest share of poorest people on this planet. And again, it should not be a surprise looking at this that you have the highest share concentrated here in sub-Saharan Africa, and then South Asia. China actually has changed. This data is a little bit older, but China's has really transitioned out of poverty, but nonetheless it's still considered a developing country. And then of course you have South America, a little bit better, and parts of North America doing really well, as well as parts of Europe and Australia right here. B40 represents or it refers to the bottom 40%, of people. So what this chart is looking at is the people who are at the bottom 40 percentile. What are they considered? In sub-Saharan Africa, right here, the bottom 40 are considered extremely poor, as you can see from this graph, or moderately poor in some places like South Africa. In South America, the bottom 40% are considered vulnerable. In the United States and the like, the bottom 40%, Western Europe, Russia, US, North America, Canada, the bottom 40 are considered either middle class or higher, right? This is the B40. Here are some charts that look at the number and percentage living on less than $1 a day, and we compare regions throughout the world in 1990 and 2005. And as you can see, the largest share of people living on less than $2 a day, largest share by in terms of people, and are those in East Asia and the Pacific, South Asia, and of which India is the largest part of South Asia right here, and then China. But in terms of percentage, the largest percentage of people who are living on less than $2 a day in 1990 were in China, as you can see right here, 84.6%. But in 2005, that had dropped to about 36%. India, it had gone from 83% to 75%, where you had the least gains. In other words, the area where extreme poverty, though it has gone down, did not go down by much, is sub-Saharan Africa. It went from 76.1% of the population was living below $2 a day in 1990 to 72.9% in 2005. We can look at similar data for those living between $2 and $13 a day. And again, it shows that these are folks who are doing slightly better than the extreme poverty, but not rich by any stretch of the imagination. In India, that number increased from 17% to 26%. But in China, which is sort of the great tale to tell here, because China adopted many market-based reforms during this time period, China went from a really poor country, because only 15% were living on $2 to $13 a day in 1990, to nearly 62% in 2005. So great leaps made in China. In sub-Saharan Africa, again, nominal increase, 23% to 26%. Overall in the world, 33% of people were living in 1990 at $13 a day, and nearly half were. So progress has been made, and a lot of this, of course, there's arguments about this, but a lot of this has to do with the globalization of the economy and the globalization in general. As free trade has spread, incomes have risen, but so has income inequality, and perhaps that is the big story here. This looks at the number and percentage living below $13 a day. So the previous two charts we saw below $2 a day and then between 2 and 13. And now we look at total number living below $13 a day, which is still, above $13, you are approaching middle class. So in this sense, you still see that throughout the world and in the poor regions of the world, vast majorities of people are still in 2005 were at $13 a day. So what has happened to the global poverty rate? And this is again based on the $1.90, the extreme poverty rate. I should have mentioned this earlier. PPP from your last lecture stands for purchasing power parity. So basically, this is a way of adjusting dollars for purchasing power in different countries. It's a complicated way of saying that a dollar in India or China buys a lot more than a dollar in the United States, even though it's the same dollar. So we sometimes make adjustments to this dollar, whether when we're looking at different regions, to account for the purchasing power of that dollar in different countries. So here, what you look at is, there's the poverty rate in the 1990 was nearly 2 billion people, and this has fallen to something like 750 million to a billion. So poverty rate, extreme poverty, has fallen quite a bit in the last few years. And this is all across the board. East Asia includes China, and it's fallen most dramatically here, as you can see that. In South Asia, which the biggest part is India, it's kind of flat, but it's also gone up a little bit. Sub-Saharan Africa, it has actually gone up a little bit. So extreme poverty now is kind of concentrated in two parts of the world. Really, it's South Asia, of which India is the biggest part, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Again, this is more data that looks at the share of the population below the extreme poverty threshold. Okay. So exactly what is going on with poverty and what, how can we explain this? Well, in general, the general trend is that poverty rates have been falling across the board, but they have been falling more in certain countries. China, of course, being the biggest declines in poverty have occurred there. But the other part of the story also is that though poverty has fallen and globalization is in large measures to sort of responsible for this, the income levels that have been rising throughout the world have not benefited the lowest or the most poor. Rather, they have gone, especially in developing countries, but also in developed countries like the United States, rising incomes have really gone to the upper middle class and the upper classes disproportionately. So what this really means is that the pie has gotten bigger. That means the world is making more money. Poor people have gotten less poorer. We have some middle class that have grown depending on the region. China in particular, huge middle class. India less so. Sub-Saharan Africa less so. And in many developed countries, the middle class, if you adjust wages for actual purchasing power, has actually shrunk. But the upper middle class and upper class in developed countries like the US has actually gotten richer. So this is kind of a complicated bag of goods. So if you're evaluating, whether globalization is a good thing or a bad thing, you really have to look at, well, who has it benefited? It's not enough to say that people are generally richer. We have to ask ourselves, well, who is richer? And have we done enough for those at the bottom? And certainly right now, even though the poor have gotten less poor, we still have quite a bit of ways to go to making this a more equitable or creating a more equitable distribution of income across the planet. Again, this underscores that global poverty has gone down, but sub-Saharan Africa has lagged. Sub-Saharan Africa, if you don't know, refers to those countries below Northern Africa. Northern Africa has countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, and so on. Sub-Saharan Africa are the countries below that. Again, same thing. Global poverty really is in three regions. What are those regions? Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and then also parts of East Asia and the Pacific, of which China is a part, but it also includes other countries. East Asia and Southeast Asia. It includes countries like Vietnam and Burma and so on. And so poverty has not fallen as much in those places, but in general, poverty has gone down, with the exception of Sub-Saharan Africa and then India. Again, more charts that sort of look at the same trends again. So earlier, I had asked the question, are there other ways that we can look at human development, not poverty per se, but human development? So this presents another multidimensional poverty index, which takes into consideration not just money, but also things like education, health, living standards, and so on, and combines them into an aggregate index, right? So because in some cases you can have countries that are very poor, for example, like Sri Lanka, but that have a very high literacy rate or have more gender equality. In other instances, you can have countries that are relatively wealthy or rich. Parts of the Middle East are like that, where people have money or households are wealthy, but there's profound gender inequality. There's profound lack of democracy, things that are very important to human development. This is an example of this multi-poverty index applied to different parts of the world. Now, this is an interesting chart. We look at the experience of the bottom 40% of households and see, whether their income grew or not in a 5-year period, 2007 to 2012 approximately. What's interesting is that if you look at, so 5% growth right here, 10% growth right here, you look at different countries that are sort of arranged in this ellipse around in this graph, and you notice that most countries, experienced a growth of some type. On the other hand, if you look at some countries, they actually lost money, right? Oh, I'm sorry, money is the wrong way to put this, but household incomes actually contracted during that time for the bottom 40%. And for example, in Ireland, in Iceland, in Italy, in Cyprus, and so on. And if you look at also the United States of America, it also had a similar experience. United States shown right here. If you follow this, what you notice is that there is very minimal growth and a negative growth, because the solid bars represent annualized B40 income growth, and the average population income growth are the transparent bars with black contours. So in the U.S., the average population income growth did occur, and nowhere near 5%. You see there's a little blip right there. But the bottom 40 actually dropped down right there. Okay, so the U.S. is also experiencing income growth overall, but for those at the bottom 40% of society, they did not. They actually experienced an income contraction, right? And so this is very important to measure, this bottom 40, because it basically asks the question, how are our households and families who are at the very bottom of society faring? It does not ask how is society faring overall, because sometimes, again, as I've mentioned earlier, you can have an increasing pie, an overall increase in total GDP, gross domestic product, in the nation, but that does not necessarily translate to an increase in household wealth, or because GDP income growth may accrue to corporations and then mostly to elites. or GDP income growth may trickle down much more to the upper middle class, and lower income class, depending on government policies. What are these government policies? They involve everything from taxation, at the corporate level, as well as other schemes to redistribute money. Why is bottom 40 growth important? Well, bottom 40 growth, it really is reflective of how the nation overall is doing with respect to not just creating prosperity for those at the very top, but for everybody that is a resident of that nation. Another measure of income inequality is the Gini index. And the Gini index basically the Gini coefficient measures the distribution of income in a country. As I mentioned, a score of 1 indicates maximum inequality and 0 perfect inequality. So the lower a country has a score closer to 0, the more equal it is. The higher the score it has, closer to 1, the more unequal it is. And here we're looking at the absolute change in the Gini index. In low income, that's blue; lower middle income, red; yellow, upper middle income; and then green, higher income countries. And you can see that in many of cases, there's profound change in inequality, and across the board, there is a change in inequality. Here we look at a comparison between the United States and Chile to look at how prosperity is being shared with different population groups. So B40 is, of course, the bottom 40%. And if you look at in the United States in 1990, there was income growth among the bottom 40, and there was an increase in the income share. But however, as the pie has gotten bigger, the relative share of the bottom 40 has gone way down. Well, not way down, but it's declined. But quite the opposite effect in Chile, which is poorer country compared to the United States, but nonetheless income is better distributed. So the bottom 40 has experienced a increasing share of the overall income. So here in this graph, it's kind of a complicated graph. We are looking at different countries. They're OECD countries. These are the rich countries, and the bottom 40 experience in these rich countries in the last 2 decades. So the dotted line right here represents the average of the bottom 40 living standards for all of these rich countries. Now, if you look in the United States, the GDP per capita, which is the blue dot, is actually lower than the average for all rich countries, right? So our average for GDP, or gross domestic product per capita, is actually lower than that. The B40 living standard in each country, the green dot, is represented also on this chart. So some countries, like Scandinavian countries mostly, are above the average, right? So bottom 40 in Finland, for example, have a much higher standard of living than the average of all rich countries. Okay, then there's some corrections made for this measure, and these corrections include corrections for health, corrections for income inequality, and correction for job. So the average income growth, for example, might occur among the bottom 40, let's say in Portugal, which is still a bit below the average, right? The overall average right here. But what is pulling Portugal down really is correction for jobs. So though there has been some increase in average income, what is really pulling down is Portugal is that there has been quite a bit of job loss, and probably job loss that disproportionately impacts those who are at the bottom of Portuguese society. So the experience here, what's the take-home message right here, is that in rich countries across the board, some countries have made significant progress. They're all kind of at the left right here, in increasing B40 living standards. Other countries, which are kind of right here, and U.S. is part of that, have actually, though the overall societal income has risen, when you correct for income inequality, in other words, in the U.S. we have profound income inequality. Correction for health and jobs, it tends to pull down all the progress that has been made, especially among those who are at the bottom of society right there. And again, this is sort of a restatement of the same thing. The evolution of living standards in rich countries is very different depending on the rich country that we are looking at. Finland, as I mentioned earlier, and Australia have really, seen significant improvements in the last 2 decades. U.S. and Japan, on the other hand, have had much smaller improvements. Here's another chart that looks at the bottom 40. So here in this chart, we look at, as I mentioned, the bottom 40 at a variety of countries. And what's interesting about this chart is that what you can see is that the experience of the poor is profoundly impacted by policies that redistribute money. In other words, policies that actually provide benefits to the poor to offset some of the impacts of poverty. So in Ireland, the poor before taxes and transfers are the highest in this comparison group right here. This is the red bar right here. But after the poverty rate, after there's taxes and transfers, redistribution of some income, including welfare, drops quite a bit. You see, this is the blue bar right here. In the United States, in contrast, the poor before taxes and transfers are lower than Ireland right here, but the transfer is not significant. So after taxes and transfers, you have a poverty rate in the United States that is actually higher than Ireland, even though in the beginning, before taxes and transfers, that was not the case. Moving away from developed countries and the bottom 40 in OECD and other countries, we look at the least developed countries. These are the poorest of the poor. The definitions that we use here are those that have a per capita income below $750. That means $750 per person per day. That's their per capita income. Very, very low. In contrast, the United States is nearly $60,000 per capita. These guys are at $750 per capita. They have weak human assets. This is in terms of the other indicators of development, such as literacy, healthcare access, and health status. They are very economically vulnerable. In other words, even if there's some progress when the world economy is doing well, they tend to be the most impacted when there is a recession. Where are the least developed countries located? Again, not much of a surprise. A lot of them are located in sub-Saharan Africa and then South Asia, Afghanistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, which is Burma, Laos, Cambodia, and then some in the South Pacific as well. So how do we measure poverty in the United States? As I mentioned earlier, there's a federal poverty line, and you can read about it if you want to, and the area median income measurement. The federal poverty line is the measure that is used across all of the states in the United States. So let's talk about that a little bit. The federal poverty line results in measurements like this. This is 2013. What this is telling us is that a single person household, that's household of one, if they made less than $11,500 in 2013, they were considered poor. If you're a household of one and you made $15,000, you were no longer poor. This goes up to, for example, a household of 8, and you can add, for more persons than 8 as well. If you're a household of 8 in 2013 and you made less than $39,630, then you were considered poor. That's a household of 8 that makes about $40,000 is considered poor. So this household of 8 was making 50,000 a year. They are no longer poor, and everybody in that household is also no longer poor. This looks at the poverty rate in the U.S. From 1959 to 2014, and this is the federal poverty rate. So you can see it was very high in in 1959. Yeah, nearly 1 in 5 people were considered poor. 23%. Actually, 1 in 4 people almost were considered poor. And these dark bands right here are recessions. So the poverty rate has gone down since 1959, and then kind of flattened out after 1970. Today, it hovers somewhere around 12 to 14%. This is going in 2014 has actually improved quite a bit because the economy today is doing fairly well. For the last year and a half, 2 years and a half, there's been quite a bit of expansion, particularly since the 2008 recession. Um, and this looks at the total number in poverty. So in 1959, you had almost 40 million people living in poverty, and then it dropped a lot. And this is because of a lot of social service programs were implemented during this time, and then the number has sort of flattened out and risen a bit. So 47 million, 48 million, maybe 50 million today who are living in poverty. And how is this poverty rate measured? We saw this earlier right here. This basically looks at, and you can read about this. I've posted something on Blackboard that looks at the measurement of this poverty rate. But basically, this was created by an economist, Molly Orshansky, part of the Social Security Administration, and which this is late 1950s, I believe. And because she noticed that a household that spends typically a third of their income on food. So basically, she estimated for every household size, what would a household of 1, household of 2, household of 3, and so on need to spend on food, for a basic food that provides adequate nutrition. And she took that dollar figure and multiplied it by 3 to come up with the threshold for poverty. And this has been adjusted since the time she came up with the measure using the consumer price index, inflation, essentially. Right. So this one of the crazy things about this measure, and you might be thinking this yourself right now, is that, well, I mean, it doesn't really account for the great variation in cost of living. Sorry about that. Across different regions. One of the ways we account for the variation in cost of living is using the area median income. Now, one thing to note here is that the area median income measurement is really used by maybe cities and sometimes states, but is not really used by the federal government. A lot of federal government programs use the poverty rate because their basic argument is that, we need a uniform measure, that applies to Kansas as well as California. And unfortunately, that leaves a lot of people in California where there's a much higher cost of living who should be classified as possibly poor based on the cost of living, but they don't qualify because of the universal federal measure that is used. And most of the money, anti-poverty money, welfare comes from the federal government. So anyway, area median income, how does this work? You basically take the median income, which is the middle income. You take all the households in a given area. So for example, in Los Angeles County, you might take all the households in Los Angeles County and stack them up, right, from the poorest household to the richest. And then you go smack dab in the middle of that, right in the middle of all that data, and you pick the median income household. That becomes the middle income. It's not the same thing as the mean or the average. It's the median income. And then based on that median income, in LA County, it's around $50,000 or so. You can say that a household that makes 80% of that AMI, area median income, is low income. Household that makes 50% or less is very low income. Household that makes 30% or less is extremely low income. So in LA County, 80% of 50,000, let's say, would be around 40,000. So a household that makes less than 40,000, this is a household, not a person, household, household can be more than one person. A household that makes 40,000 or less in LA County, for example, would be considered low income. Middle class typically is somewhere between 75 or 80 and 125% of AMI. So middle class in LA County would be somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 a year. Let's look at some more data now. This chart looks at the US again. In this chart, we are looking at the percentage of people living in poverty areas. And the darker you are, well, the more people, higher percentage of people in your state are living in poverty. So in California, this is between 20 and 30%. In Texas, this is 30% or more. And I want you to keep this in mind, considering that California is often considered a business unfriendly state, whereas Texas is considered a very business friendly state. Yet there are more people living in poverty in Texas. I wonder why. This looks at changes in poverty the first year after a recession, right? So the most recent recession ended in somewhere in June 2009, and you had a 14% living in poverty. After the recession year ended, you actually had a slight uptick in poverty, and then then the downturn in poverty that has happened over the last few years. So, and this is the experience in every major recession. You can see that right after recession ends, there's actually an increase in poverty. So the question then becomes, who is benefiting from the post-recessionary economic expansion? And the answer, of course, is in the United States, certainly those in the upper middle and upper income ranges. This looks at poverty rate by age. Kind of an important thing to note here is that if you were in 1950s, the elderly were most likely to be poor right here. However, a whole slew of programs that redistribute income to the elderly have reduced their poverty rate in recent years. So they're the least likely to be poor now, somewhere around 9%, 8%, somewhere in that range. The people who are most likely to be poor are those under 18 years of age. That has stayed about the same, from about 26% to about 22%. Working class is also about the same. Initial decline right here, and then around 14%. The working age range is 18 to 64. This is the same data we just saw earlier, except the chart goes out to 2014. This chart looks at median income by household by race and ethnicity, and what the experience has been for the median income for various races, and Black, Hispanic, all races, white, not Hispanic, and Asian. And it looks at what the median income is by race and ethnicity, and you can see again what the highest income is. Here we have another chart that looks at earning by gender, and of course the most obvious thing here is the earning. Male earning is much higher than female earning, and on average, and this is where we get statements like a woman makes 79 cents for every dollar made by a man. It's about 79%. Although historically it has climbed, but there's still quite a ways to go before we achieve a gender parity. Here we look at census tracts and poverty experienced by census tract in the United States. And what we notice here is that people who, for example, identify as Black alone or white alone or Asian alone and so on, their experience and where they live. So a Category 1 tract is one where less than 14% of people live in poverty. A Category 4 is more than 40%. So the higher the category, the more people live in poverty in that census tract. So if you look at the experience of all people, most people live in a Category 1 tract where only 14%, well, it's not only, but 14% of people live in poverty. However, this is, when you disaggregate this, there's a huge difference when you look at this by race. For Black alone, for example, only 36% or 1/3 of people who identify as Black live in what could loosely be considered a upper middle income census tract, a Category 1 tract. So in summary, looking at these slides, we see that the experience of poverty is very different for different races in the United States, and this chart gets in terms of where different people live by race and ethnicity. Asians have the highest percentage of people living in a Category 1 census tract where you only have 13.8% poverty. And the African American or Black have the lowest percentage living in a Category 1, which is the census tract with the least amount of people living in poverty. And then a few concluding slides here. I just wanted to share these with you. I look at the recession's impact on young adults, and I thought this was kind of interesting because it really looks at the how the downturn had a pretty significant impact on young adults. So, and in many cases, young adults, it impacted them by compelling them to stay longer in their households with their parents, by delaying their household formation at the time when they leave their house, parents' house, guardian's house, to form their own households, by diminishing job prospects, by delaying marriage and even childbearing. And some of these effects are still lingering. The percentage of men and women staying with their parents is a pretty good difference here. Consistently, women have been 8 to 10%. Men, however, went from 13 to 18.6% right after the recession. Not sure why this is the case. And then the differences between men and women, as well as men and women in education levels among those who live at home and don't live at home. And of course, the take-home message here is that those who have attended college, those and who are women, have probably the lowest probability of living at home. And this makes sense. Education is correlated with income. Income is correlated with forming your own household. And this looks at, again, living at home by race and ethnicity, and the differences between the Latino, Black, and white young men and young women. So in summary, the story, it's a complex story when looking at poverty and globalization. Globalization overall seems to have had an impact across the planet of reducing overall poverty. However, any income gains that have happened because of globalization have accrued in an uneven manner, with those in the upper middle income and upper income ranges accruing the most benefits. And now what you have is we have a robust economy in the United States in 2017, 2018, and a pretty robust economy throughout the world. However, and I'll be posting some things to highlight this, the impact again of this economic expansion that has happened in the last few years is even more unevenly felt by different folks in both developed and developing countries. The United States election in 2016, with the election of President Trump, was in many ways a referendum on globalization and how the impact of globalization has been so unevenly felt among the working classes in the United States. And the same can, of course, be said of developing countries as well. Okay, well, thank you for listening, and more to come. Stay tuned.